Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the Gladden Longevity Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeffrey Gladden, and I'm here with Stephanie Venn-Watson. As you know, on the Gladden Longevity Podcast, we're really focused on answering four questions. The first one is, how good can you be? Which is a global question. The second one is, how do we make 100 the new 30? Third is, how do we live young for a lifetime? And the last question is, how do we live well beyond 120? Can we crack the Hayflick limit? So as you know, we have many technologies that we utilize to enhance our health and longevity, but we're really devoted to those four questions, and that's what drives all of our progress. So with that as a quick intro, I'm really excited to be talking with Stephanie today. She has a fascinating story. We've actually done a podcast together previously, and we were talking about Fatty15, which is a 15 carbon saturated fat that is the first essential fatty acid, I guess it's been discovered in the last 95 years, or with something close to that. So really fascinating stuff. And I know they've been doing research and some other things. So with that introduction, Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Great. Dr. Gladden, it's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you in person. So just to refresh the audience's memory, give them a little bit of the backdrop, a little bit of your background in terms of being a marine biologist, the dolphins in Coronado, and some of that story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a veterinary epidemiologist by training and worked for World Health Organization, CDC, was recruited by the Navy about 20 years ago, maybe a little longer than that now. And
how did they recruit
you? They had accumulated so much data on their dolphins over a 60-year period. Navy has dolphins. And they really wanted to their credit, dive deeper into the long-term health of dolphins.
Oh, wow.
And they said, we're sitting on all this data. It would be great to get a
veterinary epidemiologist. But how did they come across you?
It was a connection of a friend from veterinary school who was working for the veterinary in the Navy. And she's like, I think I might know the right person to bring in for this job.
That's not the usual thing that shows up on Indeed, right? So,
yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Cool.
So I joined the Navy team there, Navy's Marine Mammal Program. They have cared for a population of bottlenose dolphins for over 60 years and a sustained population of about 100 bottlenose dolphins. Because they get such great care, they live a lot longer than they do in the wild.
Yeah, you said almost twice as long.
Yeah. So they live like in the wild. So they lived in their 20s. Navy routinely lived into their 40s and 50s. So with that, we had geriatric dolphins and started seeing that some, but not all of the older dolphins were developing aging-associated diseases like chronic inflammation, high cholesterol, fatty liver disease, and even Alzheimer's.
Yeah. Actual Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's.
Really? Okay. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. But do they have the genes for Alzheimer's disease? Have you looked at that?
So we don't know yet about the genes, but what's been fascinating is when you look at the histopathologies of the changes in the brain consistent with Alzheimer's, that we were seeing it in the Navy dolphins, as well as it's now been reported in numerous wild bottlenose dolphins too. So it does appear to be a naturally occurring disease in a long-lived large brain mammal.
Interesting. I wonder if whales have it.
I would be surprised if they didn't.
Yeah, there's some long-lived whales, right? I think beluga whales live a long time. Right?
They live a long time. Yeah, there are some whales that lived they think, about 200 years.
That's right.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, amazing. So in that population, I think there was a subpopulation, right? Even though you have these dolphins that are living 40 years, 50 years, inside that group, there were differences.
That's right.
So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we saw these changes, that some were aging healthier than others. And we actually identified a measurement of aging rate in dolphins. And we found...
what was that? What did you use?
It was hemoglobin.
Was
one of the main... So declining hemoglobin over time was predictive, and increased red blood cell distribution with. So RDW.
Right.
So
let's define that for the audience, because not everybody knows what RDW is.
Sure.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so red blood cell distribution with, it's a measurement of basically how different sizes, the variability in red blood cell size.
Right.
And it can tell you a couple things, doctor.
Right? But just so the audience understands, so your bone marrow is making red blood cells, and they can come out in different sizes. But the healthier you are, the more uniform in size they are, right? And so that's the healthier membranes, the healthier the cells are, et cetera. So this RDW is really a measure of how much variability is there in the size of the red blood cells, right? And so a lower number is better in that situation. And that's something we measure in all of our clients here. Also at Gladden Longevity, it was always in our labs, but we didn't know exactly what to do with it. Now, when we heard about it's an aging metric for dolphins, it's like, well, maybe it's an aging metric for mammals. And I guess it's been shown to be an aging metric for mammals.
That's exactly right. It's been a fascinating index for things like chronic diseases, aging rates. And so, and it's, it's, as we look and we know more now, it's making sense because red blood cells become representative. The longevity and the health of our red blood cells now we're realizing directly reflects the health of all of our cells and then therefore us. So it's great and easy to test.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in the dolphins, you would start to notice that as they aged, the RDW went up.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, but there must have been some disparity there between these populations. Because there was some group that liked a fish that was high in C15, as I recall.
That's right. Exactly. Okay. So as we started seeing differences, even among individuals within the same population, some had slow aging rates and some had fast, right? This was fascinating because like you're saying, it's the same population of dolphins. Did this advanced technology called metabolomics to look at bunch of small molecules in their all fish diet in their blood. And like you just shared, C15 was the leading predictor of slow aging dolphins.
And when you're measuring C15, because we actually C15, we went back and started to look at some of our testing that we do, and actually C15 shows up in one of our Genova NutriVal tests. But I'm curious with the metabolomics, how is it? What's the best way to measure C15? Is it in the red blood cell membrane? Is it in the plasma? Or what's your take on all that? And what were you doing with the metabolomics?
Yeah, so with the C15 measurement, probably the red blood cell membrane. So what you're getting from Genova is probably the best measurement, especially with regard to longevity and our long-term health. So you're already doing.
We're already measuring
the right measurement. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then is there, with most things in biology, it's what I consider an economy of balance. Like you can get too little of something, you can also get too much of something. So do we know what the sweet spot is, or do we have a sense for what the sweet spot is for C15?
We do. It's a really interesting phenomenon with C15 that there does seem to be an ideal level that we're now recognizing as there's almost 3 levels that we're recognizing. We have a paper in review currently at Metabolites. So we'll talk a little bit about what's in that paper, but what we're identifying, and this is also leaning upon lots of studies on humans with C15 levels, that there's low C15, and that's where we're heading toward the potential definition of a nutritional deficiency syndrome. And that's less than 0.2% of all fatty acids in red blood cell membranes. And then there's not deficient, so healthy. And that's really the sweet spot as far as optimal. The broadest health benefits come in this around between 0.2 and 0.4%, equal to 20 micromolars, or I think what your readings you may get is 5 micrograms per mil. And it appears that we need that amount to be able to best have anti-inflammatory activities, metabolic balancing, all these activation of PPARs and AMPK and inhibiting mTOR. Wonderfully, it's all around that same level. So it's telling us this is what we need. There may actually be optimal levels that we're just learning now that goes above and beyond
the normal levels.
And that's based upon a study that was done in Sardinia looking at the blue zone folks, high longevity and low longevity folks, showing that the high longevity people had C15 values as high as 0.4 to 0.6.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So double to triple what we're used to, having in most of the world.
Well, that's really fascinating because it kind of makes you wonder if there's, and I've wondered about this, if there's kind of a linear effect, both in terms of longevity, but also with regards to measuring RDW. Is it kind of a linear thing? Like, do the people that have levels of 0.6, let's say, or 0.5, are their RDWs, their red blood cell sizes are more tightly clustered in terms of being uniform, or how does that work?
It's a great question. We don't know yet. So it's going to be a great thing to be able to look at. I mean, even probably here at the Gladden Longevity Institute.
We're looking at it.
But that would be a great thing. We do know at these lower levels that, when you get to below 0.2% and above, that there is this linear relationship between the two. So then the more is like, as we get beyond normal to optimal, do we see that tighten up even more?
Yeah, no, it's pretty interesting. One of the metrics that we've started measuring here is whole body phase angle, right? So whole body phase angle is a measure of, it's for the audience, it's basically a measure of cellular health. And it has to do with resistance and reductance. And basically, the higher the number, typically, there are some things that will falsely elevate it. But if you know the individual and they start at one point and you can raise it, and they haven't put on weight, developed cancer, or something else that would artificially raise it, it could be a sign of increasing cellular health. And that's basically the cell's ability to, as I think about it, to hold a charge, if you will, right? How robust can it hold a charge? And the more integrity you have in the cell membrane, the greater the charge it can hold, the more energy, in a sense, it has to work with. And so we're measuring RDW on all of our clients as well. In fact, we just collected data on everybody that's been on Fatty15, looking at RDW and also whole body phase angle. So and we don't have enough. What we determined is we don't have enough data yet to be able to make any conclusions. But I will tell you that we were dosing everybody at a particular dose of 100 milligrams a day. And that may not be what we need to go for in the longevity space. Before we get to dosing, though, let me have you delineate a little bit about what you see this doing to the cell membrane, and then also the impact that it has on some of the other longevity metrics. But maybe start with the cell membrane.
Absolutely. So, and that's really the heart of C15, right? So it is a promiscuous molecule that does a lot of good things.
Promiscuous molecule. Okay. All right.
It gets around to the different receptors.
Is it a pluripotent molecule or a promiscuous molecule? I don't know. One of the other. Okay.
Consumer-friendly version.
Very consumer-friendly.
Pleiotropic, exactly. Right. And so, but as far as the heart of what C15 does, that is truly, unique to this Goldilocks fat, is that it is a stable, saturated, as you shared, an odd chain stable saturated fat. It has no double bonds in its structure, which means there's no weak points in the molecule that could get attacked by oxygen into lipid peroxidation. And it's that weakness, it's like that's where we used to, like, polyunsaturated fatty acids are oils, right? Because of these double bonds. Yeah. C15 is a stable, saturated fat that its job is to go into our cell membranes and really shore it up and armor our cells up and literally protects them against lipid peroxidation.
Okay. So that's an interesting point. We also can measure lipid peroxidation, which is interesting. And just so the audience understands, there is a reason to have saturated and unsaturated fats.
That's
and
right, it's a balance.
When you think about, we need omega-3s, omega-6s, omega-9s, etc., those are unsaturated fats. And the thing to realize is that when you're eating fish and you think you're getting omega-3s, it's really the cold water fish, because a saturated fat will be a solid, like butter's a solid sitting on your table, whereas the unsaturated fats are an oil. So if you're a fish in cold water and all you have is saturated fats, you're going to freeze up, so to speak, right? You're not going to be able to swim. But if you have these unsaturated fats, they'll be more liquidy and you can actually still move around. But that being said, we're all at, homeostatically at about 97 or 99, whatever it is, we are 98.6. And so at that temperature, we don't really have to worry about whether it's saturated or unsaturated. We actually need both. So that's interesting. So you think it's really shoring up the structural integrity. Is it doing anything else besides the structural integrity? Because it seems like it might be.
Yeah, it does a lot beyond that. So with regard to activating receptors, some key ones are, with regard to longevity, activates AMPK and inhibits mTOR. Right. So with regard to cellular signaling.
So that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. So rapamycin is used to inhibit mTOR. And then we have other things that will actually activate AMPK, like cardiovascular exercise, right? Fasting. Saunas will actually do it. Things like metformin, berberine, resveratrol. All those things can activate AMPK. So when you activate AMPK, you're actually activating a lot of your longevity genetics, DNA repair, kind of putting your body into more autophagy, where you're recycling the old, throwing out the bad, recycling into good new stuff. So AMPK is like super important for longevity. And then mTOR is super important for building bone, building muscle, building skin cells, looking good, feeling strong. So you need them both. It's just we have to go teeter-tottering back and forth between them, right? So it sounds like Fatty15 in higher doses. What's the dose curve on that? Like if you're taking 100 milligrams versus 200 versus 300 versus 400, is there like a linear amount of AMP activation and mTOR inhibition, or how does that work exactly?
So there's been limited of how far out they've stretched the dosing, but we do see a dose response within this, what would be equal to like 10 to 30 micromolars, or 20 micromolars being that sweet spot.
Okay.
So when we talk about dosing, for every 100 milligrams of C15 we take in, it's a good rule of thumb to go, you can go up by 0.1% of your total fatty acids, or go up by 10 micromolars. Okay. So if our goal is to be 20 and above, then most people are around this 0.2. So that does suggest that whatever it is we're doing in our lives, we're right at that kind of breaking point of deficiency versus. So we just need a little bit more to get us up and over.
And we do get C9 or C15 rather from other sources, right? So we get it from dairy.
Dairy fat is our by far our primary source. So non-fat milk has no C15, but once you get to that whole fat milk, you can get your 100 milligrams of C15 from dairy fat, at least from milk fat, at least we used to. We now are learning that our C15 levels in whole dairy fat even is dependent upon what cows eat.
Oh, wow.
So they have about half as much C15 for cows fed all corn versus twice as much in cows fed grass. So grass fed.
Okay. So grass fed dairy has higher C15.
That's
interesting. Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And it's interesting because we all got into the low fat milk and all that kind of stuff. So we kind of were robbing ourselves of some of this things that we didn't even know were healthy. So the AMPK mTOR story is interesting, but it's actually doing more than that. It does other things with regards to the hallmarks of aging. So tell us a little bit about that.
So we're now up to 6 out of 12 of the hallmarks of aging. And this is
actually, we're up to 16 hallmarks.
Oh, God. So. I'm still keeping up with all of this. I was at 12.
Right.
And this is thanks to work that we've done, but now the world is working on C15. So it's been fun watching the story continue to grow. So we know that it helps it with regard to the mTOR inhibition with cellular senescence. It decreases over 18 pro-inflammatory cytokines, again, in that sweet spot, targeting inflammation. With regard to mitochondrial dysfunction, C15 actually has a rescue function to help repair mitochondria. They're often broken in this one spot. Mitochondria use basically this stepwise way to make energy. It's usually that first step that's broken. C15 can skips that first step, so it allows mitochondria to
really?
Yeah.
So the respiratory transport chain 1, it actually can skip that?
To 2.
Okay, that's interesting. I was not aware of that because you need NAD for 1 to work, as I believe. So, that's interesting. So when you're increasing C15 in the cell, you're getting more cellular integrity, you're balancing mTOR and AMPK, and you're also improving energy production?
Exactly. We're repairing those mitochondria, getting the energy production up. With regard to, and we talked about cellular signaling, because, off cellular signaling is a part of a hallmark of aging. We've talked about the AMPK and mTORs, and it also inhibits JAK-STAT and HDAC6.
So talk to us about JAK-STAT.
It's fascinating receptor. I guess if we're nerdy enough here.
What's that?
If we're nerdy enough, it's fascinating.
No, it is. It is interesting. I came across it in a context of another peptide that somebody was developing, I don't know, a decade ago. But it's not something that we're using consciously all the time. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this pathway is responsible for inflammation. It's also responsible for cancer cell proliferation.
Okay.
And so it's become a really exciting target in the pharmaceutical field to help with autoimmune diseases, to calm down. So, you hear a lot of the injectable options for autoimmune disease. A lot of those are JAK-STAT inhibitors.
That's right.
Things like for rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune diseases are everywhere now. I have it myself. And then with regard to cancer proliferation, helping to calm that down on the JAK-STAT. So the fact that it we saw C15 was, ineffective. Actually, others showed that it was a JAK-STAT inhibitor. Made a lot of sense, especially when we see our customers reporting back, and myself with an autoimmune disease, really seeing that being able to calm down. It's like, oh, we understand why.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really, really interesting, both in the cancer cells and also in the autoimmunity. So is that also a linear dose dependent kind of effect?
That one is, yeah, both of those are linear dose response.
So I imagine you could be taking C15, Fatty 15 for general health, and then every 100 milligrams, you're going to bump yourself up 0.1%.
That's right.
But if you're dealing with something like autoimmunity or cancer or another issue that's related to, inflammation, let's say, going higher seems to have a linear effect in decreasing the inflammation based on the JAK-STAT inhibition.
That's right.
Is that the story?
Yeah. And we're seeing that same linear effect there was a study by True et al. And they showed that the higher the C15 levels, again, getting to this 0.4 to 0.6% level, the lower the risk of developing cardiovascular disease over time.
Okay.
And so it may be, and that is linear.
Well, we know that cardiovascular disease is inflammatory driven, right? Events at least are inflammatory driven. So there's more to the story than just inflammation, but of course that's really kind of a driving element of it, right? Interesting.
Part of that.
Mm-hmm. That's intriguing. So have you done any studies, or maybe in the dolphins, the ones that had higher C15 levels, did they have better cardiovascular systems? Was any of that looked at? Better brains, better cardiovascular systems, whatever?
Yeah, they had a lower cholesterol.
Total
cholesterol.
Okay.
They do have a little bit wacky HDL versus LDL
ratios.
It's different than ours. But if you looked at total cholesterol, they had lower levels of that, lower inflammation.
Okay.
Dolphins are pretty good at being protected against cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
What we tend to see with them are, for us, which are precursors for cardiovascular disease, which is this metabolic syndrome. We identified this dysmetabolic iron overload syndrome, or DIOS in the dolphins, which is now emerging in people as well. And it's been a really intriguing part of the story. So
tell us more about that.
Yeah. So, dolphins, a big advantage of the Navy dolphins is it's a very clean population. So in people, you're going to have a bunch of different risk factors, a bunch of different phenotypes being driven by our environment, by our different genes, right? The dolphins was a pretty clean population to work with. So they really have
By clean, you mean it's a fairly uniform population in a fairly uniform environment.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so they really developed one phenotype of this metabolic syndrome, which was a combination of high cholesterol, elevated liver enzymes, ALT and AST and GGT, and then this mysterious hyperferritinemia, high ferritin. So it's like indicative of there's iron overload.
Yes, and also ferritin is an acute phase reactant.
That's right.
Right, so it'll go up with inflammation. Not to get too nerdy here, but we're talking about some different enzymes that when the liver is being irritated, let's say, or inflamed, either from excess fat that's being deposited in the liver from insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome, as it's referred to, or related to hepatitis, or either chemical hepatitis or viral hepatitis or alcohol-induced hepatitis. All those things will release these enzymes into the blood that can be measured. And those are signs of liver irritation / damage, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so we started seeing these elevations. And so we worked down that exact list of rule outs. So all of a sudden we started seeing dolphins pop up with these elevated enzymes. They would come and go. They seemed fine. They might have been off, eat a little bit less fish for a couple of days, but nothing major. And when we started looking into it, we said, gosh, is it a viral, a hepatitis? Is there bacteria? So we kind of worked down that rule out list, and we got down to this looks metabolic because it was associated with this insulin resistance, high cholesterol. And then that's where then the iron picture came in. We're like, well, gosh, why do they have, high? And when we looked at,
so do you think it's an acute phase reactant for them, or do you think it's also something else metabolically going on with iron?
We think that it's going on with iron. So we had the good fortune of the Navy had saved all the tissues from past dolphins. So we were able to actually look at dolphin liver tissues, and lo and behold, iron deposited in their liver in unusual amounts. So we're able to basically find the single phenotype. And all of this then was associated with low C15. So long story short, what we've gotten to with the dolphins, it appears to be that there's a set of people that this is happening to as well, where we have low C15, that makes our cell membranes fragile, including red blood cells. The red blood cells get weak.
Okay.
They get engulfed by the liver because the liver says, I'll take out any of those.
So it's excess processing of the red blood cells, which is liberating the iron from the hemoglobin. So now you're getting more iron.
That's
release.
it.
Okay.
So now the iron's sitting in the liver, gets that iron overload, and then it really seems that everything else happens from there. So you have a combination of lipid peroxidation in the liver because of the membranes, and then you have paired with iron. And at the time, this was 2012 when we published this paper, and we said there's this iron overload, liver iron overload associated with metabolic syndrome. We didn't know it at the time, but in 2012 is the same year that Columbia University published a paper in which they discovered a whole new way cells were dying, and it was called ferroptosis.
Yes, I've seen ferroptosis.
So then it was like, wait, this is what's happening in the dolphins.
Yeah, it's so much iron that it's toxic. And the interesting thing is that these people, in humans anyway, I think they can become anemic. And so the doctor wants to give them iron, right? Which is like, well, you need iron, right? But actually that's exactly the wrong thing for them, which is really fascinating. Yeah, so looking at the high ferritin, so we do measure ferritin on everybody. And it's interesting, there are genes, as you know, in humans, hemochromatosis genes that can cause people to maintain or retain or accumulate more iron, which can be damaging to tissues. So we do some things for those people because we test those genetics for everybody, like having them give away blood, basically, right? Donate blood, or we just take it out and throw it in the trash. But that can be a good way to kind of get some of the iron out. But I wonder if in a hemochromatosis patient, if really boosting up their fatty 15 levels into this 4, 0.5, 0.6 range would have a salutary effect on what's going on for them.
Yeah, exactly. So what so when we gave dolphins a higher C15 diet, we saw all, the components of this whole syndrome be attenuated, so decreased in severity. Right. So we actually, and mice, interestingly, mice don't behave this. We behave this way. We respond this way, but mice don't. They're just a different metabolically. Right. So, but we were able, there are models that then repeat the same phenotype where the red blood cells get weak. They results in liver iron deposition, and then from there you get insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, all the downstream things from that. And we supplemented that model with C15, and every single component
parameter went away.
There was the anemia and the red blood cells were alleviated. The iron deposition stopped in the liver. The amount of fibrosis in the liver decreased. It was a model of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or NASH. Really
so do you think that it all leads back to increasing the integrity of the red blood cell, right? I do. So basically you're taking away the initiating factor of a weak red blood cell that's done being gobbled by the liver, depositing the iron and causing the issue, right?
You're so smart.
Oh, well, you're the one that figured it out. I'm just trying to follow along. So that's exactly it. And in fact, in this paper that we have in review in Metabolites, we're proposing that this whole phenomenon is a C15 nutritional deficiency syndrome. Fascinating. That's really fascinating. Well, that's like super exciting for anybody that's dealing with, and I think there's this trial that you've done on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease now too, which is not the iron accumulation. It's another metabolic syndrome that happens for humans. It sounds like maybe that's not true in dolphins, but it's an epidemic, of course, here with overeating, high carb diets, saturated fats, all the different things that go into it. Carrying excess obesity, not enough exercise, many, many things factor into it. But at the end of the day, these people are insulin resistant. They end up depositing a lot of fat into their hepatocytes, which is called steatosis. And that's kind of the beginning of really a whole progression into a fibrotic liver and a cirrhotic liver. And the next thing you have liver failure, then you're on a transplant list. So we've actually taken some people that were on transplant lists and actually reversed their whole liver situation using AMPK activation. That was the only tool that we could think of that might be super helpful. And it turned out that it was actually super useful. And I'm wondering if the fatty 15 is is working primarily, it's magic in these non-alcoholic fatty liver disease people primarily through AMPK, or are there other mechanisms that you've identified?
It could be, for sure. AMPK, I think, is playing a role. It's also a PPAR alpha delta activator, which has been a target for candidate drugs for NAFLD.
Well, that's also amazing because PPAR gamma is associated with peroxisome function.
Yeah.
Right. So this is, now we're getting super techy on this podcast. I apologize for this, but when you look at neurodegenerative diseases, things like ALS and things like that, one of the things that we measure here is peroxisomal function, right? Through a prodrome plasmalogen scan. And it turns out that when your peroxisomes can't make these special fats called plasmalogens, you're at high risk for neurodegenerative diseases, right? And so I'll just leave it at that. There's more to it than that, but I'll leave it at that. So if there is a way to actually improve peroxisomal function, things like jumping into cold plunge is one way to upregulate PPAR, right? But if you can take Fatty15 while you're jumping in your cold plunge,
you get a 1-2 punch.
You get a 1-2 punch. That might be a really interesting thing to use in anybody that's suffering or has a predisposition towards a neurodegenerative disease, whether it's Parkinson's, ALS, Alzheimer's, any of those would be really, really interesting.
Yeah, and because dolphins can develop Alzheimer's, we have a whole nother study that'll be coming out, published later this year. But we did take, because of, we know that they're susceptible to C15 deficiencies, that we did take C15 and we ran it against a panel of targets for Alzheimer's disease. Okay. And had some very exciting findings.
So tell me about that. What did you find?
Well, it will be coming out soon.
Yeah, I know, but you can whisper it. You can whisper it in my ear, and I can repeat it.
So one of them is interesting. We'll share one because it's just too exciting to withhold. But it is an FAAH inhibitor. So these are enzymes in our blood that eat up cannabinoids. So let me step back for a second. Okay. That there are receptors in our brain throughout our body that are called cannabinoid 1 and 2. They're named that because the world discovered them because it's the targets that cannabis has. Right. They aren't there for cannabis.
Right. But we have our own endocannabinoid system, right, where we're making things that stimulate those receptors.
Exactly. Sure. So those receptors are there for those natural molecules that we have. And so there's been a lot of research to try to figure out how can we leverage endocannabinoids to help support brain health, long-term brain health. Because as we get older, those receptors tend to start slowing down.
Interesting.
And not doing their work. But the problem is that when we try to give endocannabinoids, we have these enzymes throughout our blood called FAAHs that just eat them up right away.
Got it.
They have no chance to even make it to our brain. Okay. And so it ends up that not only, I think we might have talked about this in the prior podcast, does C15 do our bodies use C15 to actually make an endocannabinoid? Okay. It also, now, thanks to the study, shows that it also inhibits the enzyme that eats up the other endocannabinoids. So
you've got a double 1-2 punch there too.
Yeah. Yeah. Really fascinating.
That is fascinating. So now you're increasing the endocannabinoid system. So when you increase the endocannabinoid system's function in somebody that's struggling with neurodegeneration, let's say it, what's the net effect of that for them? Do they start to show cognitive improvement, or they have fewer plaques, or what happens for them? Less beta amyloid or less tau?
It's mainly, a lot of research is being done on that front. And I don't know with regard to in the midst of disease, does it reverse or stop it? I think a lot of the work has been more done on the early side of things and or prevention. Right. And I think probably a big role of it is neuroinflammation. So endocannabinoid system, even though we talk about more of it,
anti-inflammatory system.
Anti-inflammatory and right at the, in the core organ that we care about with the brain. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that benefit is just coming from helping to calm the inflammation down in the brain.
One of the things that I've discovered is that I think most brain fog comes from neuroinflammation. It can happen for a variety of reasons. You can get hit on the head. You can eat the wrong food. You can, your sugar can spike. You can eat the wrong fat. You can eat whatever it is. But ultimately, it kind of comes down to neuroinflammation. And interestingly enough, we do plasmapheresis for people here, where we're actually removing inflammatory cytokines, right?
That's
and we could do that for several days and then put in young plasma and then put in rejuvenation factors and do all kinds of magical things. But it's interesting that, if you can do plasmapheresis for somebody that's complaining of brain fog, they'll wake up the next morning and say, I feel like crystal clear. It's like, I haven't felt this clear in years. And it's like, okay, I get it. It's really neuroinflammation. Yeah. So if we have the ability to kind of go in and modify somebody's diet into a low inflammatory diet and get them doing the right exercise and cold plunge and other things that are activating all the right things. But if we could use Fatty15 to help modulate the entire system, not just be an anti-inflammatory, but to modulate and downregulate the system, that would be pretty magical.
Yeah, I mean, it does. That word magical comes up a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And that it does a lot. We've talked about it a lot on this talk, and it's really, I think it's an essential fatty acid.
Yeah,
and so it's just nature has found a way for us to use this molecule, truly it being essential to help keep things balanced for as long as possible, which then helps with our longevity. With the neuroinflammation point, fascinating studies have come out showing where depression they're calling it a neuroinflammatory disease.
Right. It's an inflammatory disorder. Yeah,
so it's really incredible of being able to look and see, because we do have a lot of customers who are improvement in mood. And again, I think you're right. I think that a lot of this for these people, it has to do with calming down that neuroinflammation.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. It can even, when you have neuroinflammation, it can also show up as personality changes and increased aggression or anger or decreased resilience sort of to the environment of what's happening around you, right? So it's not just cognitive, it's also sort of on the psychological side, which is kind of interesting. Yeah,
absolutely. And so we work with a group called Gray Team, and they're in Florida, and they provide support for post-deployment or post-warfare veterans who are at risk of suicide.
Yeah.
And
that's a massive problem. Right. I would think all those guys should be not eating the dolphins, but taking a lot of
that's right. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah,
but taking a lot of Fatty15. It seems like it would help their brains. Does this help people recover from things like traumatic brain injury or brain surgery or concussion or any of that kind of stuff? Maybe you don't have that information, but it seems like it could theoretically.
It would be a great study to do. Yeah. I mean, certainly with regard to mechanisms that we know to help with brain injuries, with calming inflammation, being able to activate, the right receptors. It is aligned. PPAR alpha delta has been a target for post-traumatic brain injury. So it would be consistent, but studies need to be done.
Theoretical. What about autism? Any theoretical concepts there that, those brains are kind of working in a different mode? They've got gut biome issues. They've got vitamin D receptor issues. They've got lots of things going on that have been identified, but I just wonder if this could play a role there.
It's possible. It's possible.
No data on it yet.
Yeah, but no data on autism yet. A lot of factors have been looked at, but nothing's been found. So, a big thing with us is timing of things that have been happening on the negative side of our health since, as soon as you start looking at the 1980s, because that's really when C15 started dramatically coming out of our diet.
Sure.
The late 1970s.
Low fat everything.
We were told, Congress came out with dietary recommendations telling us to stop eating saturated fats.
Right.
So we've really been focusing on what trends, and which, can include autism, but what trends have been happening since that time, which, coincided with the dolphins ended up getting less fatty fish in the 1990s, which is how they started developing C15 deficiencies by accident.
Yeah. What's interesting when I think about it, if you're improving the integrity of red blood cells, I wonder if you're improving cardiovascular capacity, right? Which is another thing that we measure here is cardiopulmonary exercise tests on everyone. So we can look at VO2 max and anaerobic threshold and things like that and get a real feel for the cardiovascular system's physiologic function, right? But with these more integrity red blood cells, is there an increased oxygen carrying capacity on some level?
So there's a study that supports that. And that is, it was a study that was done to look at people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So COPD.
Right. And these are typically people that either have a genetic predisposition, alpha-1 antitrypsin, I think, or they're smokers, or they've been exposed to some toxin or whatever, and it damages the lungs, and the lungs they can't move air efficiently up and down, particularly can't get it out.
That's right. That's right. So they were looking at saturated fats in their diet, and seeing if it had any change in their pulmonary, if it had any association with pulmonary function.
Right.
And so what they showed was, amazingly, of all the different fatty acids, they actually looked at all fatty acids, not just saturated, of all the fatty acids that they measured, that the higher amount of dietary C15 they ate, it was the only one that came out as significant, had a linear association with improved
COPD symptoms.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. This is really fascinating.
I know. It's just like I hesitate even saying all of these because it's just too good to be true. Right. I think again, it's just like essential. It's an essential.
Yeah, it is interesting when you come across something, and there are many things like this, quite honestly, right? But when you come across something that it kind of works at a fundamental level in terms of cellular health, it just spawns itself across many, many different populations and many different activities in the body, which is either, it can be either a negative, right? Like something that's bad for you, or a positive like this, which is like amazing. So super fun.
Our team often says it fixes you where you're broken. Like at a cellular level. Okay,
that's what you have your priest for.
I love it.
Right. So, okay, fun. Good. Well, it sounds like you guys are doing amazing work. So you must be incredibly excited about projects that you've got underway. What's underway for you from the standpoint of research projects?
Absolutely. So we have a couple of really exciting studies in the works. One is focusing on anemia. So as we get older, as we've talked about the importance of red blood cells, we get older, higher risk of anemia. So it's basically the extreme phase of high RDW, red blood cells are getting fragile. At some point, you develop anemia. So use of C15 for anemia, we've seen that work for dolphins and in relevant models. So we'd really like to do a formal study to see how that works with people. There's no treatment really for anemia long-term, safe, if it's iron deficiency, but now we've kind of shown that may not be the actual and then the other is the work with Alzheimer's work coming up. So really kind of diving into mechanisms of C15 that are supportive of our cognitive and brain health.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting. We do brain testing on everybody here too, both computerized and also EEG testing. And we can look at brain activity. We actually look at it a couple different ways, but we can look at brain activity, and we can actually upregulate brain activity using transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is not the typical, hammered into one section of the brain for depression. It's more of a lower level, but it actually is more also diffuse across the brain. It moves across 4 different areas of the brain, and you can actually upregulate neuron activity, and we can see the EEGs start to show improved activity where you can wake up the frontal lobes again and things like that. I'm really curious if adding this to that would be helpful. We're adding things that improve brain-derived neurotrophic factor because we want to get the neurons what they need to be able to, grow more dendrites and do things like that. So we're using things like lion's mane and an inhaled peptide called C-LANC, which is quite helpful. But I wonder if this would also have a really nice role there. Could be interesting. We could put it in our protocol.
I'm ready to be a patient at your longevity institute.
Come on in. Sure.
That's great.
No, it's good. Yeah, we try to leave no stone unturned because we're completely serious about making 100 the new 30. So
you've got to catch it early, so much earlier than what the traditional tests and medicine does. We're too late at that point. So being able to catch these things early and understand how we can impact them at the early stage is critical.
One of the other, I'll just bring this up, and this will be a hypothetical question because you probably don't have the answer. But, one of the other things that happens as people age, as their immune system really starts to lose its potency, right? It becomes what we call senescent. It loses its ability to adapt to new challenges, if you will. I'm just curious if C15 has any impact on the status / function of the immune system, the youthfulness of the immune system. If you probably don't have any data on that, but I'm just wondering if in the dolphins, if you saw that their immune system was working better, their T lymphocytes, natural killer cells, any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so we did see when we did this study to look for markers of aging rates in the dolphins. We saw declining hemoglobin, increasing RDW.
Right.
We also saw decreasing lymphocytes, just like in humans.
Right.
So we still, more work needs to be done to see. We know for sure that we affected C15, helped to reverse that aging rate trend in hemoglobin and RDW. So next up, we'll be looking at this immune senescence to see if we can help on that side. It's most of the work to date. In fact, all the work to date has been focused on how do we calm an overactive immune system.
Right.
But just as important is let's make sure that we've got those functioning parts, up and working too.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, and that's part of the reason that the immune system becomes senescent is it's overworked over here trying to take care of this old viral infection or old bacterial thing that's going on, right? And or autoimmune disease that burns itself out. So fascinating, really fascinating. Well, it was a pleasure chatting to you the first time. I think it may be even more of a pleasure chatting to you this time. We're chatting here in person, but really wonderful conversation. Thank you for that.
It's been wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, how do people learn more about what you're doing, your websites and all that stuff? I know you're, Fatty15, you can go out and purchase it on the internet, I believe, but why don't you just let people know how to do that?
Sure. So they can go to fatty15.com to learn more about the supplement and be able to purchase it there. And then all the great science that we're talking about is at discoverc15.com. Okay. So we put all the peer reviews.
So it's on two separate websites.
That's right.
Okay. discoverc15.com and then Fatty15.
That's right.
Okay. So if you're listening, if you want to get the science, discoverc15.com.
Yeah. And it might help put you to sleep too.
Okay.
It's a whole lot of science.
Okay. I thought maybe there was a sleep benefit to C15, but it's just reading the research.
It's just reading the research.
Okay. Yeah. I got it. Good. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Gladden. It's wonderful being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast. If you would like more information on what we've discussed or other topics, please reference the show notes or go to gladdenlongevitypodcast.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter by searching Gladden Longevity. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to get future episodes delivered to you and share our podcast or this episode with someone in your life that you may find benefit. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another exciting episode. The Gladden Longevity Podcast is provided for informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of a physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The use of any information and materials linked to this podcast is at the listener's own risk.